Radio 786. Hear the difference.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all our listeners, and welcome to the late night conversation with myself, Mohammad Groenewald, and our producer, Shuaib Hassan. And of course, we're coming to you live from Radio 786 on 100.4 FM stereo. Tonight, of course, we be in Youth Month, so it is sort of fairly appropriate to discuss youth matters and so on. We've just celebrated our Youth Day, June 16th, and of course, we need to kind of look at the challenges of youth and some of the issues pertaining to our youth, and also more importantly, how do we take some of these ideas forward and these challenges. I know we sit with huge challenges when it comes to youth, because youth makes up a large percentage of South African population. There is a history that emerged. We didn't decide one morning, after apartheid ended, with that we needed a youth day. It's a youth day that has significant historic value, and therefore it was only appropriate in 1996 when we sort of sat down as a country to decide what days are we going to celebrate and commemorate. And of course it was only appropriate that we take June 16th as Youth Day because of the youth that has made such a huge contribution to our country. So with me today is two very interesting guests, and the one I will start off with Dr. Jacob Cloete, who holds a PhD in political science, also a very creative character. He's a filmmaker, researcher, and also has his own YouTube channel. I've checked out some of his stuff, very, very interesting stuff, and I hope towards the end of the show you can he can tell us, more about that and so on. And then we're also in conversation with Saajidah Cassiem, who is the chairperson of the Muslim Youth Movement in the Western Cape, and she is currently studying law. And of course, Saajidah interesting into the conversation because Saajidah herself come from a family of activists, both a mom, a dad, very active, both in the Islamic movement during apartheid and so on. Were probably the people that plan many protests and therefore would of course be making some fairly valuable points into the discussion, and of course being part of the Muslim Youth Movement, one of the oldest and national Muslim youth movement in South Africa, and of course a movement that has contributed significantly during the struggle days, and it really made a mark on the South African scene. So welcome to Radio 786 and to our program, our late night evening program here. Can I ask maybe Jacob just to give a very brief introduction on yourself, and then Saajidah can follow after that.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and my pleasure to have this conversation. I think it's quite a very important conversation that we need to have in South Africa. And as you rightfully put it, is that if we don't commemorate it, then I think it dies down. And the historical background and contextualizing this conversation is brilliant. You're actually a really, really good storyteller. So my story is I am born and raised in a small town called Butterfontein in Namaqualand. And I eventually made my way to the University of the Western Cape. After some time working in the South African Defence Force and later in the community, and then I decided, after experiencing tremendous both overt and covert violences, and I could see the structural violences and the explicit violences, I decided there needs to be an answer to why people are killing each other and why people are poor. and that led me to study a PhD, or not study a PhD. It was not even my initial aim. It was just to do a degree and then do something about it, and then it led me to a PhD in political sciences, focusing on violence. And my postdoctoral work now is focusing on the Khoisan San identities, and just picking up where I left with the work on the other violence in the Great Lakes.
No, thank you very much, Saajidah. This is a quick background. I know Saajidah is much younger, so she might not have this. She's still a student. So yeah, let's see where Saajidah story.
Assalamu alaikum. Shukran, Uncle Mohammed, for having me. Yes, I am quite young blood, as you would put it. I'm Saajidah Cassiem, and I am the chairperson of the Muslim Youth Movement of the Western Cape. It is a national movement as well. I think Youth Day affects me being a youth myself, because based on your background that you've given about Youth Day, it speaks a lot to our education as well. And I see myself that I would not have been able to be studying right now as a colored female, especially if we still had those apartheid policies in place that restricted certain levels of education for certain people from different racial backgrounds. And so I'm grateful that we are commemorating such a day, because it reminds me that I am grateful to have been able to apply to a high school, to a university, and to even get an education that is worth more than something that would make me just a physical laborer of some sorts. My story, like you have also mentioned earlier, does stem a lot from my parents' activism back in their younger days. They were part of the Muslim Students Association, and a lot of Muslim activists and Muslim students took to the forefronts as well during the apartheid regime. And under the Muslim youth movement, things like Al-Qalam was also started, which was a Islamic newspaper, which was also very much contributing towards activism back in the day. And I myself decided that as a youngster, it was very interesting to me how these policies had come about and how they were changed. And through this policy creation, I decided, well, what would be a sort of a career that would help me to understand how these policies are shaped and how they can be changed, and how it can be a contributor to the community in making youth understand that they need to be more motivated, that they need a lot more to just bring them closer to an ideal that can help them to understand that this is a historical day. Because if you go out there in these more underprivileged communities, if you ask a youngster, oh, did you know today's Youth Day? They're going to tell you, no, I don't understand what you're talking about. And so that also inspired me to do something like law, and hopefully this degree will help me to forward further policies that can inspire youth even more.
No, shukran for that, Saajidah. I think, that's sort of where we will go into later in our discussion and so on. And Jacob, for your just initial input there. So Soweto is a very unique place, even during the struggle. 1976, it sort of, youth started to uprise. There had this uprising. And, there's often a saying that if Soweto sneezes, the rest of the country catches the flu. And that was sort of almost a catalyst, 1976, for things just to spread like wildfire. People became far more organized throughout South Africa and so on. That is where we say that youth, traditionally in South Africa, since 1976, has always been the engines of change. They were the one, even Mandela them. They were youngsters in their days, and the elders said, no arms resistance, no. And they felt armed resistance is important, and we need to take up arms, to fight the oppression that we are suffering under, and so on. So again there, young people being the engines of change and driving the movements into a very different direction, and so on. Where youth are today, how would you, in fact, both of you, of course, comment on this, describe, there seems to be a huge lack of youth activism. And today's discussion is purely to look at youth activism and how to get youth back, especially from our more underprivileged areas. How can we use June 16th, 1976 example and to bring it to young people today and to say, look here, how do we make them active, not even in terms of activism, but also active citizens within our community?
Thank you for that. There's actually two views, or I see two realities currently. So I see a level of activism amongst young people in South Africa. But that level of activism is mostly in universities. So the post-apartheid era also had its June 16 moment, and that started off in 2015 with the Fees Must Fall movement, which crippled the higher education sector. At the time, still working at UWC, when it started at WITS, we never expected that it will reach the Western Cape and affect the universities in the Western Cape, and the national shutdown just happened. And we always thought that UWC is a university that is for the masses. It is for the underprivileged, the kind of Jake Scherwel idea of the university. So we never thought that would happen in UWC. And what then happened is, especially the underprivileged young people at the university started highlighting their issues that they're facing. Issues like hunger at the university. So suddenly the food and the vendor food prices started coming up. So it became a reality. And then we kind of started seeing that there is some concessions that the university have to make. And UWC have made some very good concessions with regards to the Fees Must Fall movement. One of the things is scrapping the application fee, because that was the one thing, assisting with registrations, registration fee. So we met the students halfway. But when that happened, I was one of the people who was most critical of the Fees Must Fall movement. And I'm still critical of the Fees Must Fall movement because it starts at universities. So the person in the rural area barely gets an opportunity, especially a young person, to enter university. They're so far removed from where it happened. So I always said to the students, and I stand by those words, that the Fees Must Fall movement, even though it's youth activism, was a middle-class struggle. It's a struggle for a middle-class life. So it's just a certain group of people who is supposed to get it. So I said to them, if you really want to be revolutionary during this particular period, take it to basic education, take it to early childhood development, because that is where the real change needs to happen. Because currently, if you get a matric certificate in South Africa, it's useless. You can't get a job with a matric certificate. So I don't even know why we are doing matric certificates, because you cannot be absorbed by the economy. So the solution then is you have to come to university for further education and training. And not even a bachelor's degree is currently guarantee you a job. You need to at least reach a master's level. And with a PhD, you are more absorbable in the economy.
You're mentioning now the rural areas. The question is, I'll come to the Fees Must Fall, because I have my own criticism about that, and looking at our own struggle and what we went through and what I've seen with Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall and so on. Just perhaps to look at Saajidah, how active do you think youth are? Especially, you're from Mitchell's Plain, you have been with MYM, is primarily working in probably the most disadvantaged areas, our programs. You had your iftar in Cloete, and most of your programs are earmarked for those particular youth, sort of to raise them up and to promote a kind of program, because there's hardly programs happening in those areas. Most of our programs is these posh areas and posh mosques and churches and stuff like that and so on. And now, when we talk about the poor, it's a pot of biryani and so on and so forth. So how active is my sense that youth are active in these communities, or is there apathy amongst youth and youth participation? What are your sense to this conversation?
I think that youth are very afraid of politics. when such a discussion is started, youth tend to steer clear of the topic. They tend not to engage, or they feel like they should be more neutral. And I think that is the biggest sense of apathy that youth can have, and that will be an obstacle in being active for youth, especially when they are in high school level. They refuse to engage in political discussions, and so activism is really not exactly on the table when it comes to youth of that level. When it comes to, I think there needs to be awareness that needs to be created for them so that they can understand how these issues affect them directly. As a youth, you need to understand that the kind of actions that you take and how you try to change society today affects not only your tomorrow but your future generations tomorrow. And so that's the kind of awareness we need to create for them. We need to motivate them to understand that this is not just about those people who are active, it's about you as well. And the more active you are, the easier and the quicker we can achieve the changes that are needed to better everyone. Well, the fees must fall. I saw that a lot of students were actually very conflicted in terms of participation. They were not sure whether they should stand with fees must fall, whether they should stand against fees must fall. They wanted to participate in some of the rallies, some of them didn't. There were so many lectures being shut down. Some students were upset about this because they felt that, well, this is kind of taking away from my learning time. I would like to actually continue my education. Whereas others simply just didn't understand why students were protesting and why fees must fall was actually something that happened. And so that was for me something that I also tried to get a lot of people to share their views on, because that's what I saw. A lot of students were very conflicted and were not too sure why fees must fall is a thing, why I should participate, should I participate, and if I do, to what extent do I participate, whose side do I take, do I get a seat at the table or should I be sitting on the floor, was kind of the stance and the mental confliction that a lot of students experienced when they were engaging in fees must fall. Another thing that I saw was, I'm not sure if it was activism or more solidarity. A lot of university students would wear their high school uniforms on Youth Day in commemoration and celebration of Youth Day. And I saw a lot of university students participating in this little tradition that had been started and created. And it was a nice way of creating awareness and showing people that, our education was one of the biggest industries that took an impact when it came to the uprising and Youth Day's significance as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. But if one look at yourself, Jacob, I mean, you're one of the rare people that made it. I mean, I've been to Bitterfontein a few times. We did some work there, and I mean, that place is really... it's a very appropriate name. Is bitter. Alles is bitter daar, so say, Bitterfontein. I mean, it's very. I mean, I was shocked when I visited Bitterfontein, the first time, and so on. And subsequently, we did some youth work and so on. A very vibrant community, by the way. But often, if one look at, for example, on the school level and so on, what does it need, for young people? The bigger challenges, we have rural communities with all sorts of communities, urban communities and so on. But there's, for example, Saajidah raised a very important point, is the education level still remain. What June 6, what young people fought for, at the time, coming from a school that sort of predestined their future for them. This is what you're going to become: domestic workers, gardeners, and mixed daga, etc., that type of mentality. How far have we come in a democracy? Although there's been a huge amount of changes, schools, and so on, how far do you think education really has come, and how far And to what extent does education benefit the very vulnerable that we're supposed to protect and this democracy was supposed to protect? And whether education is still the bourgeois class and the upper class are still the biggest benefactors of the education system because they go to better schools. So how did education, in your view, sort of, has better, and does it really enhance the learner? It's because you got both experience, very rural and also urban, communities, and you've worked with youth in both of these areas. So, often we hear education is the biggest challenge, or schools is the biggest challenge, and we're not conscientizing young people at the school level. I mean, there is certain NGOs that are trying to do that, but how do you think, has our education failed us? Because that seems to be, there's a lot of issues that you can say youth are confronted with, but I primarily want to focus on, for today's discussion, on our education system as well, because that then leads to quite a few other opportunities and other forms of enhancing people's lives and livelihoods.
Before I answer that question, just something, my observation on youth apathy. So that was the second part I wanted to come back to, two views. There is a level of activism, but the majority is just in apathy. So currently I'm going all around the Northern Cape, Western Cape and Eastern Cape, and I'm doing a lot of rural work for the university and a lot of interaction with young people, and it's just apathy. It's like they're stuck. They don't know how to get out of it. So that's another reality. So there is small level of youth activism in universities, but the majority of young people are stuck. They do not know what to do, and the level of depression and things that they're dealing is just so much. But to come back to your question with regards to the education, I can just say it's inadequate. It's an inadequate education for a changing world. And this changing world is so rapid, and our education system, both basic and higher education, are not keeping up with the changes. Last year in November, ChatGPT just threw the universities, because suddenly AI is a reality. Who's doing the assignments? Is AI doing the assignments, or students doing the assignments? So universities had to scramble to be now. So they're not progressive. So they don't anticipate the change. So to answer your question, the education that young people get in South Africa is inadequate for a rapidly changing world, and that's why we have such a big or huge youth unemployment rate in South Africa.
No, thank you for that. It's time for us to just go for a quick break. And just to remind our listeners that you are listening to Radio 786 on 100.4 FM stereo with myself, Mohammad Groenewald, and of course my two guests, Jacob Cloete and Saajidah Cassiem. But when we do come back, I actually want to talk about what is the mechanisms that we can use to enhance this kind of activism in young people. Welcome back to our late night conversation with myself, Mohammad Groenewald, on Radio 786 on 100.4 FM stereo, and my two guests here today, Jacob Cloete and Saajidah Cassiem. And of course, we are discussing youth activism and many other issues pertaining to youth, and how do we kind of enhance our youth activism. Now, of course, just before we break, we discussed, of course, the historical context and youth apathy and all of these things. But now the discussion needs to move to what are the kind of programs that we can put in place. Education system is failing the vast majority of our youth. The economy is failing them, and so on. But at the same time, our hands is not tied behind our backs. And so what is it? What are the things that we can do? Firstly, on the school level. Because remember, during apartheid, we had not a lot of leadership, but these leadership could then go into these schools and kind of mobilize young people, their peers. They could mobilize their peers. And so that is how many of us got involved. Many of us then took on leadership roles at a very, very young age, and so on. And so how do we then continue that process, and what are the type of things, Saajidah, that we can start to do to kind of bring in those kind of concepts and those kind of issues, to kind of say to young people, look, let's rise up. And let's be let's rise up and let's kind of take on our own challenges.
I think that's the one question that everyone is always asking. What can we do better? How do we improve? For example, I always used to think that, public holidays, yay, time off from school. But now that I'm older, I realize, well, Youth Day is a public holiday, and yes, kids get the time off from school. Why not use that day to be more productive for the youth on a school level? Instead of saying, okay, there's no school today, why not have the education department somehow intervene? I think there's too much reliance on NGOs and other organizations and institutions to come up with Youth Day programs that are supposed to stimulate the youth and create this awareness and commemorate this day. And education being one of the pivotal points and key areas of significance for Youth Day, we should use the day and have more open discussions with students and with learners, even on a high school level, and say, listen, this day is important. It affects you because your schooling has been impacted significantly by the historical events of Youth Day. So I think that maybe instead of saying, yes, it's a public holiday and there's no school should be closed, I think that there should be something happening in place then. We're not going to do a traditional school curriculum day, but we are going to do something that is productive, that is impactful, and something that we can take back and give to our policymakers and say, you know what, this is something that we came up with, and we think that this is important, and this is how changes should happen, and this is how the education system is failing us, and this is how we feel that it should be changed and how it can work for us better.
Jacob, in your work that you do, what are the issues that you think would enhance? Even you're a filmmaker, you cover stories, you do stories, you record people's stories, and so on. What would be the catalyst that would, like the example I gave, we didn't have a lot of people, but with the leadership that we had in our schools, in our universities, and so on, had that drive to motivate and then they then enhance others to do it, and that for me is also a lack, at our schools. And of course the challenges of drugs and and all these, devastating things and so on, create a huge vacuum in terms of that leadership. But what are the things that you think young people should do to recreate that environment of change? Because most young people sit back. The Western government do what it wants, very destructive in nature when it comes to certain things, when it comes to our schools, inadequate sports, inadequate of everything, and so on. But yet, they can spend millions at white privileged schools to something very grand and posh and so on. Auditoriums and music schools, etc., and so on. And yet the schools that it really needs, it's sort of these things doesn't exist, and yet we have a huge amount of people that remain silent on what's happening on the other side, and our budgets are spent, etc., and so on. So what are the things that you think can enhance that activism amongst young people?
So I'll tell you what we're currently doing, of what I'm currently involved with at the University of the Western Cape, because we're working with young people already. So we have two programs. actually 3 programs. So the 2 is already launched, and the third one we soon will launch. So the one is a green incubator. So and it comes from a concept that I'm working with, is that we need to rescue the future. We need to rescue the future not just for South African youth, but we need to rescue it for the rest of the world. Because if we don't put things in place now, then what is the next generation? How worse is it for them going to be? So through rescuing the future, we think about a green incubator. But when you put the green incubator up, it's a multitude of projects. So then you think about alternative rural economy and how can young people then contribute to it. So one of the meetings that we have, people just start highlighting all of the lacks that we also talk. They talk about it in the school, they talk about the university, and no institutions is covering that. So they're not able to do it. So what we then decided is that we're going to do a community readiness assessment. You go in, you collect really detailed data, and then you put up the data and you see what is happening here and what is coming from it. And then you start developing with the community a 20-year plan. It's supposed to be at least 200 years, but a start would be a 20-year plan, because in 20 years you can change the generation. So the Green Incubator is one of it. Innovative green economy that think about solar, different types of energy. If it's agriculture, then it's organic. We don't go with fertilizer. So completely, we can do it. We just have to think about how can you make sustainable alternative rural economies. And the other thing that we're doing is changing the narrative. It's where we teach young people how to make films in changing the narrative. But we don't just teach them how to make films. What we do is we teach them the whole production of the thing. So it is from the storytelling up until the monetization and distribution of it. So and hopefully over the next 2 years, amazing films will come out, and young emerging filmmakers, podcasters, bloggers, people that is in the creative economy, we'll start seeing in some spots in South Africa. So that's what we're currently doing. So my solution would be, we need to have a more creative curriculum that stimulate all the senses of young people. And that is the one thing that we don't do with basic education. You get one level of education, and like you rightfully pointed out, it's the rich schools that can stimulate a child's every senses. Some children think with their hands, and some things with their brains, and some things in their heads. So thinking and learning abilities is different. But the public school just focus on thinking, getting the child to university, and that's completely wrong. We need a curriculum that support all aspects of being human, and that includes the creative part.
No, thank you very much for that, because the idea of the second economy, we all focus on the main economy. It seems that people are too focused on the main economy instead of this secondary economy and so on. And that is where I think we're missing the boat as communities. I mean, you look at simple things, fixing cars, plugs changing, those type of skills, and so on and so forth. The food industry, and so on. As South Africans, because we were taught, you go to school and you go work for a boss. Where other countries, I mean, you look at the Somali community, they can start up their shop anywhere, stuff like that, because they grew up in that culture and that tradition. They other African countries, you look at Senegal, very good with their hands. You look at, Mali, all these countries, clothing that they make, and so on and so forth. We basically come from an education system, an apartheid education system, that really framed our mindset for us. In thinking, and we divided us in such a way. I mean, the funny thing of apartheid is more effective now than it was during apartheid. We only see the results of it now. And it's only now been really where people are now more colored, more white, more Zulu, more Xhosa, etc. and so on. So what apartheid, the foundation apartheid laid down. I mean, for Verwoerd, if Verwoerd wakes up now, he said, wow, my policy is only, now we can see really the result, and we won the battle. And people are still stuck in this coloredness and blackness and so on. So our communities are far more, scattered and so on, and which is something that will all again keep us backwards. Because for me, we are all black. We are all part of the same. Struggle. If I go to Cooks and I go to Menenberg, there's a railway line dividing the two communities. No one crosses the line. Guys just come to Menenberg because they say die wyn is cheaper daar, and so on. So that offered, but that level of interaction and engagement and bringing communities together are no longer there. But that second economy is something that we are miserably failing in. So if you ask a young person, what is it that you want to do after you study? Now we're going to go look for a job. You ask the average Korean youth, what are you going to do after you study? No, I'm going to open this business. In fact, that was a study done already. So you can see how, for example, emerging economies and very established economies, there's very different ways of responding to what economy is. Because we fail to generate an economy because we were taught now be submissive. We come from a submissive kind of thing. But Saajidah, how open are young people? You're in that space of being creative. You have all the tools with you today, right? Twitter, as AI. You don't even have to do assignments anymore, which means also creativity is going to come to an end. Human creativity. Not human creativity in making stuff. Remember, these are multi-billion-dollar companies creating this kind of things and so on. But what will it take? Somebody from Mitchell's Plain to really start up the business and getting innovative and moving, or are we off the track? Because really young people need to make money and then need to participate in the economy, because actually that will enhance South Africa. If people have jobs or create their own jobs, create their own future, and so on and so forth. How do you think with that? What do we require to start that, to even start the process of that? Taking some of the stuff that was said by Jacob, we talk about the green incubator, how they use effective tools, for example, film industry, because remember, your phone is everything nowadays. You don't need those fancy cameras anymore. So how do you think, how can we get young people active in the economy, and what would it require?
I think that, as was earlier mentioned, these fancy schools, right, have the resources to equip their students and their youngsters with the necessary skills and allow them to actually flourish and improve their creativity and let it broaden out and spread out and do something with their creativity. It encourages them to be creative. Whereas if you go to your more rural schools, your underprivileged schools, these youth who have that potential are already limited. When we see that the youth in those kind of schools are not academically performing, the first thing we do is say, oh no, you need to work harder, you need to study longer hours. Whereas if we just took a different approach and said, oh, you know what, maybe this person is more creative in a different way, and we should try to accommodate that. We have limited the youth into thinking that you need to get your matric certificate and then you need to go to university and you need to study and you need to go and get a degree and you need to go into the professional workforce and and that's where it ends for you. That's how you're going to be successful. Instead of teaching them that if you are creative, if you have skills, if you've got talents, maybe you can go to an institution where these talents and these skills can be nurtured, can be refined, can be polished, and you can use them to go and start your own business. You can open up your own institutions, and you can empower yourself that way. But that is very limited, especially in our more underprivileged schools, and you don't see things like libraries or studios where students can be more active. They can practice things like drawing, dancing, singing, creative arts, things like that. Our schools don't have computer rooms where even AI, people in rural schools don't know what an AI thing is. They'll never see that unless they empower themselves to actually get to a university where they will get some level of exposure to that. And so it will require us to actually break down that stigmatized idea that formal education and getting certificates that is only about math and writing an exam and things like that. We need to move away from that, because it's like testing how fast a fish can fly out of water. That's how some students feel when they are sitting down and writing those exams, and instead they're like, I'm good at something else. I might not be good at studying, but I'm good at something else. And that's where we are limiting them from starting their own businesses, and they feel scared to actually venture out into entrepreneurship because they were told that you can't be successful if you don't have papers behind your name, if you don't have these accolades, and if you starting a business is very risky and it's not going to always pan out for you. And we need to allow our youth to actually take that risk, and we need to support them more when it comes to actually starting up their own businesses or opening their own institutions, and making them a lot more confident in actually taking that stance, and realizing that they're not limited to just an academic sense of enrichment and self-growth.
No, that's very good. And I think the underutilization of our spaces that we have, our public spaces. I see the city of Cape Town rather rents out these spaces to companies, the Good Hope Centre and so on, instead of transforming that into these art studios, into these kind of cultural spaces where young people can be creative with their talents and so on. I think also, there's a responsibility on that side and that end as well, to kind of see what is really needed in communities and how we can enhance those things. I remember in the 80s, if you used to go to Soweto, the Muslim youth movement at the time was very active in places like Langa and so on. There were so many street performances. I used to go into all these little... if you look at guys that are performing today, within our own communities. There's a guy that started on the street performing community little plays and so on and so forth. Where is that today, and where is that kind of creativity today? It's no longer there. Somehow disappeared out of our spaces and so on. It was so nice to see these young people performing. You laugh, they joke about things and so on and so forth. But yeah, look, we are coming to the end of our conversation. And we need to wrap up our conversation now. And just very quickly, Saajidah, what do you think, or Jacob, well, we kind of talked about, getting youth involved, second economy. We looked at a number of things and so on. And look, at the end of the day, we need to, how do we strike that balance? We have all these things now today going for us in terms of the spaces and so on. So what advice do you give young people, Jacob, to really go out there and do things for yourself and try to encourage others also take them with, and so on. And do you think there's a need for, especially communities level, to rethink also the way they've operated over the years? I mean, if you look at activism today, activism is NGO-nized today, It's sort of NGO that we're active today. So once the funding is dried up, these activism disappear and so on. But it doesn't touch the community. These NGOs operate completely outside of a space of the community, And so in a number of these NGOs, they haven't even lived in a township. They come from very affluent backgrounds, but they want to write about the poor and so on. So what advice do you give young people in terms of not to lose hope?
So the solution is actually quite simple. If there's a problem and you're trying to solve it, you automatically create opportunities and multiple opportunities. So we all know the problems in our community. So the moment you put your energy and time into solving that particular problem, you're creating not just an opportunity for you, but an opportunity for many other people. And that's the basis of entrepreneurship. We know the problems. So the young people know the problems in our communities. Solve it yourself. And like you've mentioned, Mohammad, already, the tools is there online. Just Google the solutions, or Google somewhere in the world, someone said with a similar problem like that, and they looking for you to reach out to them to say, come and help us in this particular community, whether it's refuge removal or whether it's food production. Somewhere in the world, someone is sitting with the same problem and trying to solve it. And that's your international network right there. So I would say, you know what the problem is? If you're trying to fix the problem, you will create opportunities, multiple opportunities for young people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's all about opportunities and being creative around in the spaces that you have, and basically look at what are some of those things that you can utilize and resources, even if there's not much resources to organize. And Saajidah, just your closing comment, but also add, is there a need for young activists perhaps to come together and to engage, especially in our rural communities as well as in our more underprivileged communities? Do you think there's a need for these young activists, or whoever there is, to sort of come together? Because, our struggles are all the same, whether you're black, white, unemployment is there, all of that are there. So do you think there is a need for these activists to come together and perhaps strategize a way forward to look at how we're going to enhance youth development in South Africa?
Definitely. There's a lot more that can be achieved when you work together, as opposed to trying to fix things on your own. You get different perspectives, you get more enlightenment, you get to see the problem from someone else's point of view, and they might not even view it as a problem, and they might already have a solution to it. And that is also one of the things that the Muslim youth movement tries to focus on, making sure that we bring everyone from different backgrounds, different areas, different environments, bringing them together and imparting on them that kind of education, holding seminars, holding youth camps, holding programs that they can have these kind of discussions, that they can work together and get each other's sort of perspectives on how these things work and how to, youth these days are very active on things like social media. Every youth who owns a cell phone is on every kind of social media platform network that you can think of. And that is where they find their sense of creativity. That is where they solve these little problems. That's where they share tutorials on how to do almost anything and everything. And I think maybe that is also one of the platforms that we should look into creating more awareness. And maybe we should also not make it seem like there's pressure to be an activist in the sense of how we look at it, being an historical figure who did such great things. But maybe we should make them understand that activism, it comes down to, just making that little bit of change, being active for yourself, being active for the people around you, for your, even just for your immediate community. So activism should also, we should recognize the smaller contributions of activism as well.
No, thank you very much. And huge, in Cape Town gebruik ons nog ons Malay terms and tramakasi. Thank you so much for my two guests, Saajidah Cassiem from the Muslim Youth Movement and Dr. Jacob Cloete, who holds his PhD in political science and doing amazing work with young people. And this third episode on the Late Night Conversation with my guest here today, Dr. Jacob Cloete, that holds a PhD in political science and very active in our communities and especially amongst our youth. Please check out his YouTube channel. And Saajidah Cassiem, the chairperson of the Muslim Youth Movement in the Western Cape. And of course, Youth Day serves as an annual reminder to reflect on our society. We need to understand them. Of course, we need to support whatever youth programs there is, and whether it's encouraging them or just being there to assist. We must also, as a community and a society, especially our Muslim NGOs, we need to perhaps change the way we do things and more enhance and work on youth development. We need to ensure that we always kind of encourage our young people and so on. And we're coming to an end of our session, but please join me next week on Late Night Conversation on Radio 786, and we will be discussing Cape traditions and the clash of conservatism in our communities and so on. But warm greetings, and please keep warm and look after yourself. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Radio 786. Hear the difference.